In other news this afternoon, Iowa native and well-known American picker Frank Fritz has died.
Frank Fritz, once a familiar face on the show, American pickers had traveled across the United States with his friend in search of forgotten treasures. Suddenly, he passed away due to a stroke that the media described as unusual but unfortunate. However, when forensic reports revealed traces of toxic substances and the FBI officially launched an investigation, everything took a dramatic turn. Mike Wolfe, his close companion for over a decade, the one who had once silently wept in front of cameras over the painful loss, is now standing trial charged with first-degree murder. Then, in a twist no one could have anticipated, Mike didn't completely deny the accusations. Instead, he redirected attention toward an even more high-profile figure, Rick Harrison, known as the Pawn King from the show Pawn Stars. The question is, why has Rick been dragged into this case? Could this be a calculated scheme to eliminate Frank and seize control of a television empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars? And is Mike Wolfe truly the mastermind behind it all? Or is he merely a pawn cornered in a ruthless power game, more chilling than any scripted drama ever written? Think you know the familiar faces you see on TV? Think again, because what's about to unfold in the upcoming series of events will change everything you thought you knew. 1. The suspicious death of Frank Fritz. When the news of Frank Fritz's death was officially announced in early 2021, the initial cause was identified as complications from a stroke. According to medical records from the Iowa State Hospital where Frank was last admitted, he was brought in unconscious after displaying a range of unusual symptoms, such as confusion, shortness of breath, and irregular heartbeats. Emergency response team reports stated that Frank was found unconscious on the kitchen floor, estimated to have been in that state for over an hour, with no visible signs of external injury. These symptoms, in many cases, align closely with a stroke, particularly for someone with a history of obesity, high blood pressure, and alcohol abuse, like Frank Fritz. However, the reactions from his family and close friends quickly sparked suspicion. Frank's cousin Jeff Fritz had shared with local media that Frank had shown significant health improvement in the second half of 2020, eating well, exercising regularly, and had quit drinking altogether. No one in the family believed Frank would suddenly pass away like that. Mike Wolfe, who was considered Frank's closest friend at the time, was the first to announce the sad news on social media with an emotional post. "Frank was the soul of American pickers. I just lost my closest brother." But from that moment on, things began to take a different turn. A few details surrounding Frank's final days quickly drew the attention of investigators. One significant event was the last dinner Frank shared with Mike Wolfe and a few old friends just before he was hospitalized. One of the people present, Susan T., a longtime friend of Frank, recalled that Frank seemed lethargic after the meal, complaining of dizziness and nausea, but still managed to make his way home. "At the time, I thought it was probably low blood pressure, as Frank often had that problem, but this time he looked much worse." These seemingly trivial details became the key that led to an entirely new direction for the investigation. About 10 days after Frank's death, a toxicology report from the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office was released, and this was where everything began to unravel. According to the 14-page document, Frank's blood and stomach contained unusually high levels of several types of benzodiazepine drugs, combined with central nervous system inhibitors. The concentration of these substances was enough to be lethal almost 10 times the normal therapeutic dose. Notably, these drugs were not present in any prescriptions that Frank was using, and they did not align with the symptoms of a stroke. This was no longer a death from natural causes. It was clearly a case of poisoning. Once the report was handed over to the FBI, a special investigative team was set up working alongside local police to track the case. The first people to be questioned were those who had interacted with Frank in the 2 weeks leading up to his death, including friends, staff, and family. Mike Wolfe, being someone who frequently saw Frank and was also the last to have dinner with him, immediately found himself under scrutiny. From there, concerning evidence began to emerge. When investigators searched Frank's private home in Davenport, Iowa, they discovered several bottles of medication in his personal medicine cabinet that had either been opened or relabeled. Some of these bottles contained traces of substances matching those found in Frank's body. More alarmingly, 2 of these bottles had Mike Wolfe's fingerprints on them, confirmed through forensic analysis. When questioned, Mike claimed that he had helped Frank organize his medication after his back pain, but the timing, location, and types of medications did not match his statement. This marked the first time that suspicion had turned into an unspoken accusation. It wasn't just physical evidence. Other indirect details began to link together as well. Security cameras around Frank's property recorded Mike being there the night before the incident, something Mike had not mentioned in his initial police statement. Furthermore, the final conversation Frank had with a close friend, recorded through a voice message, revealed clear signs of unease. In the 1-minute and 40-second audio clip, Frank said, "I've been feeling that Mike is acting strange lately. He keeps pushing me to retire from the show and hand over all the production rights to him. I'm not sure what he's up to." From being a companion for over 15 years, Mike Wolfe gradually became the focal point of a premeditated murder investigation, and in a dramatic twist that shocked the media when Mike was officially summoned to testify before the grand jury, he suddenly changed his stance. Mike denied any involvement in Frank's death, but claimed that Rick Harrison, the host of Pawn Stars, was the real mastermind behind everything. Why did Mike bring Rick Harrison into the picture? This was no random name. Rick, a familiar face from the auction shows on the History Channel, had connections to both Mike and Frank in the television industry. Although he rarely appeared with them on screen, Rick had invested behind the scenes in some product deals between their brands. And as will be clarified in later sections, Rick Harrison was not just an outsider. He was a key player in a chain of interests that could have been threatened if Frank remained alive. The poisoning of Frank Fritz was no longer just a suspicion of natural causes. It had officially become a criminal case with all the necessary elements: motive, means, and evidence. While Frank's family continued to fight for justice for their loved one, the public began to look back at the figures they once admired with a sense of skepticism. Mike Wolfe, could he truly be the murderer? Or was he merely a pawn in a larger scheme? And if Rick Harrison was really involved, what was his motive? In the heart of the case, one thing was clear: Frank Fritz did not die from a stroke. He had been murdered, and those involved had once been beloved figures across America. The case not only shook the friendly image of reality TV, but also exposed a harsh reality behind the glitter of reality shows. There is a world of manipulation where even friends can be murderers or reluctant witnesses to a devious plot. 2. Mike Wolfe, from friend to suspect. For over 10 years, the images of Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz were inseparable in American Pickers, like 2 puzzle pieces that complemented and supported each other. Mike was always the energetic, dynamic one, serving as the public face of the show, while Frank was meticulous, practical, with the primary role of assessing the value and history of the items they discovered. From 2010 to 2020, the duo became a symbol of American television, essential to the adventures across the country, from the Midwest to the South, searching for discarded treasures beyond imagination. They not only created a reality show, but also built a major brand beloved by a wide fan base. However, what happened off-screen was far from the image viewers saw. Some behind-the-scenes staff revealed that the relationship between Frank and Mike began to show signs of strain in 2018, when Frank's health deteriorated due to Crohn's disease and alcohol addiction. Frank frequently missed filming sessions, causing Mike to take on more parts in the episodes. The work pressure mounted, and the pay disparity between them also began to become an issue. According to some sources, Mike started discussing with the producers about changing the structure of the show, with plans to gradually reduce Frank's role, preparing for a future with only one lead host. The backstage tension continued to escalate. Many staff members reported that Mike became cold towards Frank, communicating less and frequently criticizing Frank when the show failed to meet its viewership goals. Everything remained under wraps until Frank abruptly withdrew from the show in 2020, without providing any explanation. In the media, Mike still shared sentimental images, expressing regret, but Frank remained completely silent. In a brief interview with The Sun after his departure, Frank only said one sentence: "I didn't leave because I wanted to." This statement later became seen as a prophecy for what happened next. After Frank's death, Mike Wolfe's actions did not reflect someone grieving a friend. Just a few days after the funeral, he was at the production headquarters discussing plans to continue the show. An anonymous staff member revealed to the FBI, "Mike didn't cry. He just asked if we were ready with the new season script and whether the audience would accept a show without Frank." Additionally, Mike made swift financial decisions, from negotiating Frank's image rights to revisiting advertising contracts. Everything seemed as if Mike had long been preparing for a future without his companion. However, the most suspicious actions were the text messages and emails the FBI collected from Mike's phone and personal computer. One text sent to a production partner just 48 hours before Frank was hospitalized read, "It's time for me to do everything. Frank's done his part. Now it's time for me to take control." Although this could be seen as a self-encouragement in the context of an investigation, this message clearly indicated preparations to remove a collaborator. Another email sent to a Canadian television distribution company was titled, "New Project American Pickers 2.0, and included a production plan for the new season without Frank Fritz sent exactly 10 days before Frank passed away. The FBI used these documents as evidence of intent and plans to control the brand. However, the pivotal moment that turned Mike Wolfe from a witness into the prime suspect was the physical evidence found at Frank's house. Mike's fingerprints on 2 bottles of poison that caused Frank's death. While Mike explained that he had been helping his friend get his medicine, the timing of the fingerprints was suspiciously close to the time of death, just under 48 hours before. When interrogated by the FBI for the second time, Mike began to change his responses. He no longer firmly asserted his innocence, instead implying that pressure from the outside and someone more powerful had influenced the situation. After nearly 6 hours of questioning, Mike suddenly mentioned a name, Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars who had business ties with both Mike and Frank. According to Mike's testimony, Rick Harrison had privately met with him at reality TV events suggesting getting rid of Frank to restructure the brand model linking American Pickers and Pawn Stars. In an email Mike presented in court, Rick wrote, "Mike, if you want to stay strong, don't let Frank's weakness drag down the empire you've built. Take action. I'll always be behind you." This statement changed the entire course of the case. Mike Wolfe, once a direct suspect, now sought to shift the investigation towards a more influential figure. Some believe this was a diversion tactic to escape guilt, but many experts consider this a potential case of complicity, or even a plot orchestrated by Rick Harrison. Specifically, Rick stood to gain financially if Mike took full control of American Pickers, from product licensing contracts to expanding the joint venture antique stores. From a legal standpoint, this shift put Mike Wolfe in a dilemma. If he was the one who poisoned Frank, the physical evidence was too clear. But if he was just a pawn in someone else's scheme, particularly Rick Harrison, the motive behind Frank's death would be much more complicated. This is why the FBI decided to widen their investigation, continuing to trace conversations, financial transactions, and relationships between the two heavyweights in the reality TV industry. Once a close friend and beloved face on television, Mike Wolfe now appeared as both weak and calculating, and could have become a pawn in a plan to eliminate Frank for financial reasons. While the public was still in shock, investigators began to suspect that Frank's death might have only been the tip of the iceberg, where power, money, and fame could have driven someone to become a murderer. 3. Rick Harrison's role exposed. When Mike Wolfe mentioned Rick Harrison during the investigation, referring to him as a figure who had a profound impact on Frank Fritz's departure, many people, including the media and fans, immediately assumed it was just a distraction tactic. In the eyes of the public, Rick is a successful businessman who is also very approachable, famous for the show Pawn Stars, one of the most successful reality TV shows of all time with more than 20 consecutive seasons. With his friendly appearance, calm demeanor, and vast knowledge, Rick has become the undoubted role model. However, what is noteworthy is the growing evidence that Rick Harrison may not be entirely blameless, as he continues to claim Rick and Mike Wolfe have had a very close business partnership. Since 2015, they have collaborated on several projects involving souvenir chains, brand franchises, and antiques. In some special deals, Rick invested in spin-off projects of American Pickers to expand the commercialization of the show. Although these collaborations were not publicly disclosed, they continued quietly through investment funds and intermediary companies. More importantly, when Frank Fritz, the co-founder and co-owner of the show's rights, was still alive, Rick would not have had full control over these investments. Following Mike Wolfe's testimony, the FBI began reviewing all emails, messages, and financial transactions between Rick and Mike over the 18 months leading up to Frank's death. One of the most notable email chains was an exchange in December 2020, just 4 weeks before Frank was hospitalized. In it, Rick wrote, "Frank is becoming more and more sluggish. Time waits for no one. Mike, if you're not leading, everything will fall apart. I'm prepared. When you're ready, I'll support you fully." Although the content didn't specify any actions, it was heavily implied and carried significant psychological impact. Similar emails continued to appear regularly, with a noticeable increase in frequency from October to January, a period when Frank's health began to decline and he was absent from public appearances. An even more alarming sign was a series of financial transfers from Rick's company, Harrison Holdings, to a trustee account linked to Wolfe Media, the company that owns American Pickers. Although the transfer amounts were not large, only a few tens of thousands of USD each time, the unusual thing was that the notes included terms like brand strategy, consulting, and fee for future direction, decision-making support. Legally, these transactions didn't violate anything, but they suggested that Rick could have had a financial interest if Frank Fritz was no longer part of the brand. What further raised suspicion among investigators was Rick's silence following Frank's death. Although the two had previously appeared together at many public events, Rick made no comment after Frank passed, until the media began asking questions. At that point, Rick reluctantly stated through his lawyer that he had no involvement in Frank Fritz's passing and that all allegations were baseless. However, FBI data showed that Rick had called Mike Wolfe 5 times within 24 hours after Frank's death, but there were no public condolences, just secret calls. Another crucial witness was Robert Harris, Rick Harrison's former business assistant. In a more than 3-hour interrogation, Robert revealed that Rick had discussed the possibility of buying a portion of American Pickers' shares if Frank were to leave the show. Rick didn't specify how Frank would exit, but he confirmed that this could happen in Q1 2021, meaning before Frank died. According to the FBI, this statement indicated that Rick had planned ahead, something that couldn't have happened without a plan to eliminate Frank. An internal email between Rick and his legal director further showed that Rick had discussed approaches to the copyright of American Pickers' content if a partner could no longer cooperate. This is a legal term often used in cases of death or incapacity. This email was sent on January 6, 2021, just 5 days before Frank was hospitalized and passed away. In terms of motive, Rick Harrison had a lot to lose and a lot to gain. While Pawn Stars is still airing, viewership has been declining since 2018. A partnership with American Pickers, particularly under Mike Wolfe's control, would help Rick expand his audience, maximize profits from merchandise licensing, and build a new empire in the reality TV antique genre. Frank, with his traditionalist values and opposition to excessive commercialization, was the final obstacle to Rick's plans. During this time, Rick was also facing serious financial problems. A leaked financial report from his company indicated a long-term debt of over $2 million USD, primarily related to the failed Pawn Plaza business expansion project in Las Vegas. The push for collaboration with Wolfe Media was seen as a solution to help Rick restore his financial position and brand image, according to a TV consultant's testimony in the case file. All of these pieces gradually form a clear picture. Mike Wolfe, who was under pressure from falling viewership and personal financial troubles, received guidance, advice, and financial support from Rick Harrison to restructure the brand. Frank Fritz's disappearance was not a coincidence. It was part of a premeditated plan, with Rick pulling the strings behind the scenes. All actions were disguised under the guise of business strategy, but in reality they were cold, calculated moves where a life could be seen as an obstacle to be removed. Investigators no longer view Rick Harrison as a successful businessman. He is gradually becoming a key figure in a murder case that has shocked the American reality TV industry. And if the evidence continues to confirm his role in this matter, not only will Rick's career be at risk, but his personal freedom could also be in jeopardy. 4. The FBI investigation. When the official toxicology report concluded that Frank Fritz died due to poisoning with a controlled pharmaceutical substance, the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) officially became involved in the case at the request of the Iowa state authorities. The incident was no longer just the sudden death of a television personality, but had evolved into a federal criminal case, with suspicions of premeditated murder, the involvement of accomplices, and a complex financial motive. From the first week of reviewing the case, the FBI quickly began investigating in 3 main directions, reconstructing a detailed timeline of those closely associated with Frank in the 2 weeks leading up to his death, analyzing data from electronic devices and financial accounts, and finally reviewing all transactions related to the ownership rights of the show. American Pickers, the key element that could clarify the motive behind the case. From security camera footage at the residential area where Frank lived, the FBI discovered that Mike Wolfe had visited Frank's home 3 times in the final 7 days of his life, including one evening when they had dinner together. Notably, in all 3 visits, Mike had failed to record these visits in the shared schedule with the crew, even though this was a mandatory procedure for those involved in the filming schedule of the show. These visits were unannounced and typically occurred in the evening. Specifically, during the final visit, Mike stayed for over 1 hour and 20 minutes, precisely around the time when experts determined that Frank began showing signs of being poisoned. Not stopping there, the FBI obtained GPS location data from Mike Wolfe's car, showing that his travel to and from Frank's house perfectly matched the timing confirmed by the cameras. At the same time, Mike's personal phone, after being seized under a search warrant, revealed some text messages that had not been completely deleted, including one exchange with Rick Harrison near the time of the incident. One recovered message showed Rick had texted, "You're too close to turn back now. Mike, don't get soft-end it," clearly to start over. The timestamp of this message was 10:37 p.m., just hours before Frank had to be hospitalized in critical condition. Additionally, investigators had recovered an audio recording from Frank Fritz's phone, a feature he used to record important conversations with producers. In the more than 3-minute recording, Frank shared with a relative, "I don't feel safe being around Mike anymore. He's been saying strange things these past few days, like he wants me to disappear. Rick also seems shady. I don't know who to trust." This was the first piece of evidence from the victim showing that Frank felt threatened and suspected both men who had been his closest associates. In addition to digital evidence, the FBI also conducted an in-depth financial investigation into Rick Harrison and Mike Wolfe. The results revealed a series of suspicious transactions carried out through several shell companies. One of these was a $75,000 transfer from Harrison Holdings to the company MW Creative Ventures LLC, listed under the purpose of Television Product Development Fund. But financial investigators confirmed this was not a typical investment. This money was transferred just 5 days before Frank's death. Furthermore, the FBI discovered that Rick had instructed his law firm to prepare plans for the transfer of image rights for American Pickers in case of changes in the senior leadership team. Such terminology in contracts is typically used in cases of death, incapacitation, or forced resignation. So why was Rick preparing such steps in advance, as though he knew Frank would no longer be part of the show? Besides behavioral analysis, the FBI also paid particular attention to personal motives, which are often the driving force behind premeditated crimes. As for Mike Wolfe, financial records showed he was facing financial difficulties. A series of unsuccessful investments combined with a bank loan related to expanding his antique archaeology store chain had left him financially stuck by the end of 2020. Gaining full ownership of the American Pickers brand without sharing the profits with Frank could help Mike restructure his finances and gain control of the product and licensing agreements with the History Channel. For Rick Harrison, the situation was equally tense. According to reports from an independent auditing team, debts related to real estate ventures and failed business models in Las Vegas had forced him to seek new sources of income. By this time, Pawn Stars had started to plateau, and linking up with American Pickers, which had a similar audience base, was a crucial survival option. But this could only happen if Frank Fritz, who opposed excessive commercialization and had veto power over new contracts, was no longer around. Therefore, the FBI approached the case as a conspiracy involving accomplices, with Rick playing the role of the strategist, providing financial support, while Mike carried out the direct actions. Though still under investigation, a wealth of data had already been presented to the grand jury, from physical evidence, fingerprints on the poison bottle, digital evidence, text messages, emails, GPS tracking to personal financial motives. A former FBI agent commented on the 60 Minutes program, "This case is a clear example of how crimes in the reality television world don't just stop at financial fraud. They can escalate into murder as the enormous profits make the boundaries of ethics and humanity blurry." Although no final verdict has been reached, the case has forced the American public to reconsider how they idealize television personalities. Mike Wolfe is no longer the cheerful friend traveling across America, and Rick Harrison is no longer the enthusiastic and humorous pawn shop owner. Both are now under intense investigation by the law and facing the most important question of their lives. Can greed, fame, and the fear of losing power drive someone to commit murder? 5. Mike Wolfe on trial. The case against Rick Harrison. In June 2024, a trial at the federal courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa, captured nationwide attention. This was an unprecedented case in the history of reality television, where Mike Wolfe, the founder and face of the show American Pickers, was charged with first-degree murder, with the victim being his longtime companion, Frank Fritz. However, the peculiar aspect of the case wasn't just the accusation of Mike being involved in the murder, but also his shocking statement in court, claiming that Rick Harrison was the mastermind behind it all. From the very first hearing, Mike Wolfe's defense team, composed of top legal experts from Chicago, built their defense strategy on two main points. First, they denied that Mike was responsible for Frank's death, and second, they shifted the blame onto Rick Harrison as the true orchestrator. In the opening statement to the jury, Mike's lead attorney declared, "My client is not the one who directly killed his friend. He was merely a puppet manipulated and dragged into a situation from which he could not escape, and the person behind it all is Rick Harrison." On the other hand, the prosecution argued that Mike had the opportunity, the motive, and had directly interacted with the physical evidence. However, the involvement of Rick Harrison in the case complicated matters significantly. The prosecution had to clearly determine who the mastermind was and who the actual perpetrator of the murder was. The trial stretched on for weeks, with numerous witnesses and forensic experts called to testify. Yet a major turning point came in the third week, when Mike Wolfe unexpectedly took the stand to testify in his own defense, a rare move in a first-degree murder case. At the start of his testimony, Mike appeared in a simple gray suit, his voice trembling and somber. He spoke about his decade-long friendship with Frank, their trips together, their arguments, and the struggles, when Frank began to decline. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Mike shared. "But I can't stay silent when I know who's really behind all of this." Next, Mike's attorney presented a series of previously undisclosed emails and messages. One of the messages from Rick Harrison to Mike, sent just 48 hours after their secret meeting in Las Vegas, read, "If you want to move forward, you have to make sacrifices. We can't carry this burden anymore." According to Mike, the term burden referred to Frank, whom Rick saw as a financial, emotional, and strategic obstacle. Another message caused a public stir. "I'll take care of the legal side. Just make sure Frank bows out." "I'll handle everything else," Rick wrote in an encrypted conversation. Although Rick's legal team denied the authenticity of these messages, claiming they were taken out of context. Digital forensic experts from the FBI confirmed that these texts were genuine with accurate timestamps and geographical locations. Mike's team continued to release a never-before-heard recording, a phone call between Mike and Rick 3 days after Frank's death. In the recording, Rick's voice was cold as he said, "Everything will blow over. The press will forget, the audience will accept it. The important thing is, you seize this opportunity. I told you, just be decisive." Though no words directly admitted to the murder, the tone and situation made the jury go silent. An important detail in Mike's testimony was about an American Pickers franchise agreement that Rick Harrison had prepared, where Frank's name had been removed from the co-owner list. The contract's date was 2 weeks before Frank's death. "I didn't dare sign it, but Rick said if I didn't, I'd lose everything, and if Frank were alive, he wouldn't allow the change," Mike shared, his voice choked with emotion. However, the prosecution wasn't easily swayed by Mike's claims. They countered by revealing Mike's fingerprints on a bottle of poison, clear evidence that he had directly interacted with the weapon. Mike admitted to handling the bottles while cleaning out Frank's medicine cabinet, but could not explain why his fingerprints were on 2 bottles containing poison. Immediately, Mike's legal team pivoted, accusing Rick of supplying the bottles disguised as supplements through a third party, and claimed that Mike was just an unwitting cleaner, not the poisoner. They also presented an invoice from a pharmaceutical distributor in Nevada, where Harrison Holdings had paid for an order containing poison, similar to that found in Frank's system. Although Rick Harrison was not formally charged, he remained silent and did not appear in court. However, with each passing day, the pressure on him grew from being a minor party in the case. Rick was slowly becoming the central figure, allegedly the hidden mastermind. A question arose in the public's mind. If Rick was innocent, why hadn't he spoken up to defend himself? Why had he withdrawn from all public events and closed down Pawn Plaza locations at such a critical time? Finally, the trial reached its climax when Susan Thompson, a witness who had dined with Mike and Frank on the fateful evening, took the stand. She recounted how Rick had video called Mike that very night, and in the brief conversation, Susan clearly heard Rick say, "Don't forget why you have to do this. Frank is the past. The future is yours." This statement served as the final nail in the coffin of public trust in Rick Harrison. Although the trial had yet to reach a verdict, it was clear that Mike Wolfe was no longer alone in the case. The evidence Mike had presented, from emails, recordings, invoices to testimonies, not only helped him reduce his sentence if convicted, but also expanded the investigation focusing on Rick Harrison and the companies involved. 6. A rotten reality TV ecosystem. After weeks of trials and debates, the case not only exposed a murder, but also the collapse of a reality TV system that was once seen as friendly, relatable, and authentic. The confrontation between Mike Wolfe, accused of killing Frank Fritz, and Rick Harrison, suspected of being the mastermind, not only took a life, but also pushed an entire entertainment industry into a severe crisis of trust. Reality TV was originally born as a response to the monotony of scripted programs. From survival shows, dating programs, to antique hunting shows like American Pickers and Pawn Stars, audiences found a sense of truth in them, real people and real events. However, as the industry grew, a darker side began to emerge. The pressure of fame came with the demand for revenue, causing former friends and companions to not hesitate in turning against each other, even to the point of literal harm. The case of Frank Fritz is a prime example. Once a companion on screen with Mike Wolfe, Frank gradually became a victim of the very fame he once desired. When the show reached its peak, Frank's declining health was no longer viewed with sympathy, but instead as a burden. Mike Wolfe, who had been by his side for over a decade, now stood accused of being an accomplice. Rick Harrison, who had stayed on the sidelines, began manipulating the narrative to serve his own agenda. Although no one openly said it, everyone knew reality TV no longer maintained its authenticity. Behind the smiles, dialogues, and negotiations, there were scripts, tense contracts, intellectual maneuvers aimed at maximizing profits and personal image control. Frank was not the first to be cut from the show for reducing commercial value, but he was the first to become a victim of what might have been a deliberate plot leading to his death. This case not only stirred the artistic community, but also made many question how major TV networks and production companies like the History Channel maintain their brands. Why were power structures like the Two Pillars model with Rick and Mike allowed to control nearly everything in the chain of shows and spin-offs? Why was there no independent system to oversee suspicious financial relationships? And why, when Frank was already ill, was he not protected from being exploited, when it was clear both his mental and physical health had deteriorated? After the initial shock, the American press quickly weighed in on the dark side of reality TV. Variety called it the Watergate of reality TV. The Atlantic published an article titled, "Frank's Death: What is Reality?" While Rolling Stone did not hesitate to declare, if what Mike says is true, Rick Harrison is not just the pawn shop kingpin, but also the mastermind manipulating lives. Audiences must also bear some responsibility in this matter. They created the pressure to maintain viewership ratings, the only metric that determines whether a show continues to receive investment. It was their expectations for surprising moments and twists that forced producers to keep the tension at all costs. And when there was nothing left to create drama, real people, real friends, even real lives became tools in nameless scripts. Looking back at the last episodes with Frank Fritz, one could easily spot strange signals. Mike's tense gaze, the stiff dialogue, the edited scenes, and the awkward distance between the two once close friends. But because audiences loved the show, they overlooked these signs. Out of affection for the characters, the public believed that everything was fine. When the truth was finally revealed, it was trust that became the greatest loss. The case of Frank Fritz serves as a warning to the reality TV industry, not just in the US, but globally. From South Korea, the UK to shows in Vietnam, the phenomenon of shaping images, strangling personalities is no longer a rarity. But now, with a shocking criminal case, the entire industry must ask itself, where are the limits of show business, and who will set those boundaries? The audience, the law, or the conscience of content creators? From what seemed like a natural death, the case gradually uncovered layers of conspiracy, financial motives, fame, and job insecurity, turning former friends into bitter enemies. Regardless of the court's final judgment or whether Rick Harrison is prosecuted, one thing is clear: the cost of fame in reality TV sometimes is death. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep up with the latest news on this shocking case. The truth, no matter how hidden, will eventually come to light.